Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Thank you very much. Firstly, it's a great honor to be invited by Manthan. I had heard about it, and there's a very distinguished list of speakers. So I'm very, very happy and deeply humbled to join them. So what I'll do will be, I'll try restricting myself to about 30 to 45 minutes so that we have more time for questions. When we start looking at, I don't want to go into the history of Indian foreign policy, but for purposes of a sort of reference point, let me start with the 21st century, because that is where major change, new elements and new changes came about, which was the 9/11 attack on US, 2001, which set the trends from which the effects of which we are even witnessing today. And those trends are what then are playing into the pandemic, and how will they go forward going from the pandemic. Now, to take one example, the war that started in 2001 is only ending 20 years later, again on September 11, the date chosen by President Biden to withdraw all his troops, although I think some contractors will still remain there. So in a sense, it's come full circle on one war. But that war has not ended or finished anything, because Taliban may be back in power. Islamic radicalism is still afoot. And the rise of China, which started during this period, is very much a major factor in terms of where we go. But let me first talk about pandemics. Pandemics, traditionally, historically, if you Google the impact of pandemics, they've been major turning points in history. I'll just take two examples. There's what is called the Black Death, which was plague which hit Europe in 1347. 1347 to 1350, it completely killed probably from 1/3 to 2/3 of European population. But it also ended feudalism, because there were labor shortages, so labor could move about. So you could not keep them enslaved. And that then led to Protestantism, reaction against the Catholic Church, Reformation. So Europe, as we know it today, is really a result of the Black Plague. So it has sometimes just destructive forces, can also have constructive outcomes. The second one is a very interesting example of France. Napoleon, who revived slavery, decided to send his forces to Haiti at the beginning of 18th century. And he wanted to go and fight a slave rebellion there. And because the slaves had come from Africa, they were immune to yellow fever, whereas Napoleon's troops were not. So the slaves were successful because the Napoleonic forces fell sick. And then Napoleon gave up his intrusion into the New World. It led to his agreeing to sell what was called the Louisiana concession, which is a southeastern part of US, under President Thomas Jefferson, to America. And all of a sudden, because at that stage, US did not control vast parts of the western part of US, the territory that US controlled doubled with that. And that really, you can say, is really the beginning of the rise of US, because no continental power then was challenging them. And all because of yellow fever. So sometimes pandemics can do it, but we can't oversimplify also, because historical change can sometimes be accidental, sometimes led by great leaders. An accidental change was Teddy Roosevelt, president of USA at the beginning of the 20th century, when capitalism was rampant. They didn't want any control at all over, and the Baron Kings were ruling the roost. He was not supposed to be president. He was a rebel-rousing governor of New York, and they made him vice president to contain him. He was out hunting, bear hunting, with no one with him, somewhere in Vermont, when US President McKinley was shot. They had to send Secret Service people to go find out where the vice president is, because he had to take over. McKinley was dying. So he came back and took over. And some of the most dramatic and radical changes which were done, from regulatory mechanisms, regulating markets, parks setting aside, etc., Panama Canal, which was able to give US ability to move their navy from East Coast to West Coast and become a two-ocean force. All this was done by this guy because of an assassin's bullet. Otherwise, he would have never been president. Narasimha Rao is another example. If Rajiv Gandhi was there, Narasimha Rao was there in the cabinet all along. But here's a man who had gone for a heart operation. He didn't even fight the election. So the greatest reformer that we've had in the last 40 years or 30 years is a candidate who was not supposed to be prime minister was in the cabinet, and his contribution to the cabinet is limited to what he did as a prime minister. So therefore, we should not underestimate what this pandemic is doing, because it is global. Loss of life may not be as high as was during Black Death and so on and so forth. But then we are a much more interconnected world. Every evening on CNN News, on your own channels, you're seeing people gasping for breath. You're seeing people dying. You're getting news of your people you knew or almost knew. They are passing away. So it's a tragedy that we are sharing on a second-to-second basis. And therefore, it's having a more immediate impact than simply the numbers may tell. Because the numbers in India may be 4,000 dying every day or 400,000 ill at any particular point. But it is touching our lives. It's touching everybody's lives. The data that we are getting globally may be quite skewed because we don't know what's happening in the developing countries. Many other countries may not know what is happening, and many other countries may be hiding the data of the sick and the ill. So therefore, let me start with that turning point, 2001. Now, with US intrusion into Afghanistan to punish and eject Taliban and their collaborators, the Al-Qaeda who had attacked them, US re-entered Asia. This is after 10 years, 91, they had come to Kuwait, and before that, they left Vietnam in relative disarray. With this entry, they began well because Taliban, but the mistake that occurred was that they did not defeat Taliban. Taliban simply fled into Pakistan, were given protection there, relocated themselves in Quetta, and continue to conduct their operations from the safety of Pakistan. So Pakistan became both a partner of US in fighting this, as well as a collaborator with the people who were creating the entire trouble in Afghanistan because they were their former allies. And this happened, if 9/11 happened, I was then ambassador in Abu Dhabi. And it is not a coincidence that 3 months after 9/11, the Indian civil aviation, Indian Airlines aircraft was hijacked on the flight from Nepal. It finally turned up in Dubai and Kandahar. Now, why did that happen 3 months later? Because Pakistan was being pushed to send all their forces to their Western Front to seal the border so that they could catch all the Al-Qaeda and the leadership of Taliban between the pincer they were creating from within Afghanistan, and Pakistan is supposed to seal that border. Pakistan needed an excuse to ratchet up tension with India and say, look, India is going to war with us. We can't move our troops. So this is how this game went on. And there's a famous US political scientist who once put it very well. He says, Pakistan is an ally which will never be a friend. India is a friend which will never be an ally. And I think that kind of sums it up. So this went on, but the mistake that Bush made was that they then shifted without finishing the task in Afghanistan. They went to Kuwait and they went to Iraq and they ejected Saddam Hussein. Now, Saddam Hussein was not a particularly sparkling international gentleman. He was the kind of autocratic dictators you saw all over the Middle East or all over the world, in Africa and the developing countries. But the virtue that he was presiding was that he had dammed up the Iranian influence to the West. And therefore, he provided a buffer for the Arab world. But once he was gone, that buffer was gone. And therefore began the natural Iranian spread of influence across what is called a Shia crescent. Because the majority of the population in Iraq was Shia. The minority of the population in Syria was Shia, but they were ruling over a Sunni majority. And the Shias were already well entrenched in Lebanon through Hezbollah. So this arc got connected. And therefore, the Americans found themselves in great difficulty that they were not able to do what they thought they would do, spending trillions of dollars, which is make a transition in these countries to a democratic or a sort of democratish representative government, which does not have all the bad manifestations of an autocratic regime. Now, as that began failing, particularly in 2006, that is where I think Bush took a gamble, and a good gamble. He brought General Petraeus back into Iraq, and he said, you have to stabilize it. We can't leave it as it is. They realized that they cannot turn it into a democracy because the sectarian divides were too wide. The Sunnis and the Shias could not come to a modus vivendi, an arrangement by which they could really have power sharing of an honest nature, in addition to the Kurds in the north. And therefore, they said, let's stabilize it and leave it at some kind of a functioning democratish government. And which is what Petraeus did, because he changed his counterterrorism strategy. They did ground patrolling, they lost a lot of men, but they were able to win back the Sunni heartland. And this is where they defeated Al-Qaeda, because Al-Qaeda had come to embed itself in the Sunni heartland, and they managed to push it back. But then something else happened, and that was the Arab Spring. Arab Spring starts in 2010. Simply one vegetable seller in Tunisia had his little sales thing overturned by the policeman and beaten up, and he went and committed suicide. And this let loose the common public ire, where people came out, where a popular protest started off, spilled over into Egypt, into Libya, into Syria, into all these countries, into Bahrain, and where the street power came in. And that is when power transfer of presidency was taking place in America. And President Obama coming in, an extremely cerebral president with a Muslim father and with a Christian mother, with a very variegated but deep background in law and liberal arts, he, unlike Bush, who was a very instinctive, low achievement student, but an instinctive politician, Obama was a very cerebral politician who thought everything through, looked at it. So the most interesting thing he did was that immediately after taking over, January of 2009, he went to the Cairo University. We had 2000 election, 2008 election. So June 2009, he delivered what was his, at that point, considered a great speech at the Cairo University. And he called it a new beginning. And he said, this is a new beginning where we have to engage the Islamic world and look at each other's interests. Because he realized by then that if popular protests, and this was before the Arab Spring broke out, he realized that if you have to fight Al-Qaeda, you can't just fight with guns. If you have to fight radical Islam, you can't fight it with guns. You have to also win the hearts and the minds of the people. This is what we've been talking about in Kashmir, that it can't be just done by a security force. It has to be a combination of the two. Otherwise, either one fails. If you do one without the other, and you don't know how to calibrate them. And then after his speech, he was tied into this argument that if there is a popular protest, because the argument that Al-Qaeda gave was that all these regimes and these dictators, so-called secular dictators in the Arab world, they were nominees of the hegemon of US. And therefore, they were not really representing the people. And the only place where the popular resentment existed was in the mosque, because the rest of the opposition, they had managed to co-opt or beat or jail or send abroad. So the opposition, their intelligence agencies had mastered the art of handling the opposition, while at the same time, they generally kept the right-wing religious elements under control through clerics and all. But once the popular protest started and the Tunisian president fled, then Gaddafi was overthrown, and then the pressure came on Mubarak. Then US was called upon to take a call. And there's a very interesting drama, which Obama, in the first part of his biography, which is out, he relates it. The debate which was taking place in White House, where pressure was coming from Saudi Arabia, the traditional Arab allies, that you cannot let Mubarak down. He's an old ally. But at the same time, what Obama had said in Cairo, that if the people of that country want a particular government, and if US is seen as siding with the dictator, then you're losing the argument against radical Islam. So it was a cerebral argument, which took a while in US White House, but finally he took a call. He kind of waited a couple of days, he slept on it, then he sent his people, they said, go and read out the Riot Act to Mubarak. They said, but Mubarak is not understanding. He said, I don't care. Then he went on the air himself and sent out a less than subtle message, where then the Egyptian military backed off and stopped backing Mubarak. But then the result was that the government did not pass into popular hands. The popular hands turned out to be the Muslim Brotherhood. There was no secular opposition left. The people who were at the Tahrir Square could not constitute themselves into a functioning political party. The most organized were the Muslim Brotherhood. And once they came in, they captured power, they started doing the same thing. They started eliminating institutions which they should have built up, judiciary. They started compromising all of the elements you needed to build a functioning democracy. And so then the two forces of radical Islam traveling from Afghanistan, traveling west, Arab Spring traveling from Tunisia, traveling east, they met in Syria. And that is where the civil war started. That's where we are today, because there the two forces created utter chaos, which then created two other elements, which we are now facing the consequences of. One was the huge number of refugees started leaving Syria when the civil war started. They went to Turkey, from Turkey to Greece, and Greece into Europe. And that started the xenophobia, Islamophobia, and the rise of the right wing in Europe. Now, this is something which also started having an effect and resonating in US, though not many went to US, but Trump and his earlier manifestations in America began picking it up as Obama was there. And then they started the thing out of Obama's birth, that birther movement, conspiracy theories, America is going to be overrun. The threat to America was from the Hispanics coming in and not from the Muslims. But the Islamophobia and xenophobia played into one construct and started building up the right-wing forces, which Trump rose to power. And that we saw then rise of Trump, rise of Bolsonaro, earlier Narendra Modi in India. He used not the Middle Eastern refugees, he was using the Bangladeshi, he was using other kinds of appeasement of the minority. But it was a universal thing. Also combined this was the demonization of globalization, because two things had happened. The lot of the working class in America had not improved. The white working class had seen America deindustrialized by Chinese industrial rise, because after they joined the WTO in 2001, see, the period coincides with this. 2001, 9/11, Americans come into Afghanistan, get distracted. December of 2000, the Chinese had been trying to join WTO for 2-3 years. The Americans and the others are pushing them to open their market, reform it. But why all of a sudden, within 3 months or 4 months of 9/11, the Chinese were given a ticket to WTO, because the Chinese were then playing ball with the Americans in UN Security Council on resolutions on terrorism, on creation of various kinds of mechanisms to compel countries to clean up their act on terrorism, on financial support to terrorism, disrupt their networks, because they realize unless you cut off the financial networks, you cannot drive off global jihad. And the other problem was that you had global jihad, but today with internet, you need not move from place to place. For recruiters, you did not need to send people out of Afghanistan. You simply created the recruitment on the internet. In fact, they say there would not have been any global jihad if it wasn't for the internet, because they used it, and these are a more educated generation of people who came in. These are not Badus out of the Saudi desert or semi-literates out of somewhere. These are highly educated people. And therefore, they were using now the very methodology which was being used for propagating positive things for their own recruitment. And therefore, Chinese used these 2 decades to rise. But in the process, they deindustrialized a lot of and affected the employment of the white working class, particularly in US. So the two forces of demonization of globalization, China's rise, and secondly, this fear of foreigners coming in, Muslims coming in, allowed the rise of the right wing, which rose in these major countries. In France, surprisingly, Macron was able to stave it off. Merkel was able to stave it off in Germany, but they did gain some. But in some countries, gained more in Austria. Then the democratic slip-up started in European Union, Poland, Hungary. You find that there's a slippage, there's more autocratic control of power by countries even within European Union, which fall well below the European standards. And so therefore there is a regression, and then came Brexit, where Britain dealt another blow to Europe by saying, we are leaving, we won't stay with you. So there is disruption which was already taking place. And Chinese had become much more assertive after the financial crisis of 2008, because they felt that they were the only country which escaped the banking crisis. Obama inherited it from Bush, did a very good job handling it, managed to stabilize the banking situation in America, and generally a run on the banks. But in the process, it fed the Chinese feeling, the Chinese who had been rising peaceably till then. And then that also coincided with the rise of President Xi. He takes over in 2012, but he was already he was a vice president for 3-4 years before that. So from 2008, Chinese get very assertive. In East China Sea, South China Sea, they start making historical claims, start bringing out the historical hurts against other countries, Hong Kong, Taiwan. So all their old agenda, where they felt that they had been in the 19th century done in by the colonial powers, they brought that agenda out. The ambitions came out in the open and came out wrapped, in a fist not even covered with a glove. It was an iron fist which was visible with PLA in combination with it. Now, this was happening, of course. Obama dealt with it in a very calibrated manner. And then, of course, let's come quickly to Trump. Now, Trump came rising this tide, but he brought in a lot of uncertainty. And again, uncertainty, like I said about Black Death, it can have some advantages. Now, one advantage was that he brought up the China challenge up front. He made no bones about it. He did not want to wrap it in diplomatic niceties. He said, America first, they've stolen our technology. He started using words which the Chinese were shocked by. But it was very clear that the Chinese could not throw him a few goodies and have him compromise. He took us some kind of a temporary deal from them. They promised they'll buy more agricultural products. They tried affecting his agricultural lobby by cutting the import of agricultural products. But Trump was, at least, there was always a fear that being unpredictable, it was quite possible he wakes up one morning and tweets that he's done a deal with China. But no, he remained a force of uncertainty. And to that extent, I think he did a bit of good, because at least the Europeans woke up. Because the Chinese were not deindustrializing Europe. They were coming in, buying up their companies and sucking out their technology. Because Chinese realized that what they needed was not only the lower end production of goods, but to move up upper end. Meanwhile, their Belt and Road Initiative was to tie in their markets globally, go continentally through Central Asia, maritime through the Indian Ocean, and therefore go up to Africa and tie up their markets and create a web work through which internet runs, through influence runs, have control of ports, initially to say we are trading. But once you have a presence in a port, say Hambantota in Colombo, they built it. Sri Lanka couldn't pay the debt back, has had to cede control over it and control over the hinterland next to it. So this was a model that the colonial countries used against China. When they took over Hong Kong and took over Macau, the Chinese model is a reverse of that you create a debt situation and you very slowly go there. And therefore you control a market, you control raw materials, and in the meanwhile, you move your production up, which is what they have been trying to do. And that's what they did during the pandemic. Now, what did they do in the pandemic? The pandemic has left them relatively unscathed because they clamped down in January. They've been guilty in not telling the world the full immensity of it. They allowed it to spread. Of course, they locked down Hubei, their own province, and Wuhan. And being an autocratic country, they were able to get a handle on it. But having allowed it to escape, they allowed a global pandemic to build up. They did not did not share. They put pressure on WHO, did not allow World Health Organization to declare a pandemic till March 12. And that is where, and I know where it's a coincidence. Why is it that right-wing leaders are the ones who have handled the pandemic the worst? It is Trump in America, who kept denying the science of it. It is Bolsonaro in Brazil. India has not covered itself in glory, because even though World Health Organization declared a pandemic on March 12, Prime Minister Modi did not declare a lockdown till March 21. Why? Because they were busy bringing down the government in Madhya Pradesh. So political priorities, religious priorities were allowed to take precedence over medical science, over what others were saying is needed now. And you did not, because the emergency had not risen, you waited an extra 19 days and then created overnight haphazard migration of poor workers in various large cities, which could have been done over a period of 1 week. And at that stage, they were not carrying the virus. So there was no mechanism created for orderly either retention of those people by paying them money or allowing them in an orderly manner to go to their villages while you had limited lockdowns. So a national lockdown was brought down, which had then economic consequences. And that is why it gave Chinese further I said, why do you think they came into Ladakh? Because they saw India on the back foot. Why did they come in much greater force than they normally come in at that time? Because they realized this was a time India's down. Let's show India further down. It's the only country which can rise to challenge China. Americans are building it up. They're talking of a quad, a combination of Australia, Japan, India, and US. So pick aside one guy which is vulnerable, as the Chinese phrase goes, skin the monkey to skin the cat to scare the monkeys. So India then was obviously not anticipating it. So this is where national security doctrines, your ability to look over the horizon, to look at the challenges, global and domestic, which will be linked. There's no such thing as something being domestic and something being international. They'll all get combined. Your domestic difficulties will get exploited. Your international difficulties will come and visit you. And therefore, we were caught off guard. And therefore, we had to cut a sorry figure. They are still sitting on some parts of our territory. We've had one trade-off because of one very good operation by our military forces when we captured the Kailash Heights. So at least from the lake area, we managed to work out a modus vivendi. But in two other Dapsang plains, we are still very much, it's work and play. Similarly, they have become much more aggressive with Taiwan. The number of flights overflying them, the threatening flights going there. With Philippines, they've sent a whole armada of supposedly fishing boats in a contested shoal, which is within the economic zone. And they have lost that case in 2016 at the International Arbitration Court set up under the UN Convention laws of the seas. But they still say, no, these are historical claims. So now we are having a revisionist rising power, which accepts many of the rules which were created after 45. They're quite happy being a permanent member of the Security Council. They're quite happy being a member of the WTO. Now, having mastered the methodology of exploiting the WTO rules, they want to abide by WTO. The ones who are complaining about WTO are the ones who set up the WTO, which is led by US, because they realize the Chinese have managed to subvert it by their state capitalism, by their indirect support, by their ability to steal, beg, borrow, and steal technology, and therefore jump ahead and create networks, supply chains and networks, which all emanate out of China. So then what Trump has left behind, and when the pandemic came, I think it has accelerated a couple of things. One is that the confrontation with China is not going away, and that is what has happened even with Biden. I will just come to G7 meeting because that has set out the future agenda. And the second one is that pandemic, we are still in the middle of it. Vaccinations, India has gone slow on it. We were in a matter of 2 months. We've gone from claiming we are a Vishwa Guru to going and asking other countries for help. What kind of a transition is it? What kind of an ability to anticipate? Because you did not stop the elections or postpone them because you thought you will win West Bengal. You did not, you preponed the Kumbh. Kumbh was meant to be in April next year. With all his vast influence over the clerics, Prime Minister Modi could have told them to stick to that date. But that date would have been 2 months after the UP election. They wanted the benefit of Kumbh for the UP election in February next year. So you allowed under 1 crore people to come and bathe. And now there are scientists supporting their argument saying there are very few super spreaders which have been created by open air things. No, they haven't. Look at the cricket game in Ahmedabad and see the condition of Gujarat. So, let's not deny science. If you deny science and you allow your religious and political priorities to overtake, then you'll go like Trump. Bolsonaro is on his way out unless he does a deal with the military and there's a military intervention because former President Lula is out of jail. But an interesting outcome of all this is the domestic change taking place. If it's going to really defeat, if right-wing leaders are going to be defeated because their agenda of hyper-nationalism, xenophobia, Islamophobia is not working, as we found in West Bengal and as Trump figured out, then what is the change? You look at Biden now. Biden's come in with a package, with a new social compact with the American people. It is the first major social retweak, socio-economic retweak after Federal D. Roosevelt's New Deal, which is from 1950, 70 years later, a country which did not believe in a welfare state, which had Medicaid. If Obama created, the Republicans complained and sabotaged it. You had unemployment in payments, but you never had a welfare state in America because Americans felt They were always a surplus of resources. They felt that that is something the Europeans did. That's not something the Americans did. But here is now Obama moving US towards it. He realizes that the white middle class is so disaffected and so badly affected. Unless you provide them a cushion, the country will flow back again into the hands of the rebel rousers. And President Trump hasn't quit yet. He still wants to probably make another bid. Same movement. And also, will there be a similar movement in India? Will there be a move that you take the vaccine situation. US is buying the vaccines and give them free to everyone, from billionaire to the poorest guy. In India, 50% of the vaccines, union government says it will buy. 50% will be divided between hospitals, private hospitals, and the state governments. And what ratio we are not told. But because there are two prices, why would a supplier sell it to the states if they are able to sell it at a higher price to the private hospitals? So you opened up the market. You have allowed a degree of laissez-faire. When there is a humanitarian and a health crisis, the union government is not abiding by its basic duty to provide every Indian a vaccination at the quickest. So instead of focusing on the supply side, going and tying up with the new suppliers, we are running so late on it that even our friend Adur Poonawala has fled to London. Now, this is a sorry state of affairs, which is, I think, going to be noted. The results to the local elections in UP are testifying to this. The next two elections coming up are Punjab and UP. And they will then decide what happens in 2024. Because if UP goes from BJP's control and BJP is not able to quickly get a handle on the economic and on the health situation in the country, then this global pandemic would have also brought about a change of political realignments in India. Now, what is happening around us? The Chinese will continue to push. They are out of this thing, but certainly they have a demographic dividend. They will bring in robotics to make up for that labor shortage, but they will face resistance. Two immediate issues before us are the RCEP, the regional cooperation deal between the 11 countries that they have created, and India has refused to join it. So if there's a regional grouping of ASEAN plus China, Republic of Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand being created on your borders, then you can't be sitting out of it. 10 plus 15 countries are there. You can't be sitting out of it. No, you can't say it'll affect the markets, but you have to be ready for it. You had so many years to be ready for it. Then there is a parallel thing, which was a tweak of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Trump left. Now, will Biden at some stage look at it? So there is a regional economic integration taking place. India doesn't want to be left out of it. There is also then the global thing, which we have to look at, WTO. Now you take vaccinations. A great move on the part of President Biden to announce that US now supports the TRIPS waiver for the COVID vaccine, which means you lift the intellectual property rights on those vaccines. Of course, Moderna are saying that they are not bothered because their technology is little known. Even if you lift it, there are hardly any scientists available in surplus who will go to any new country and set it up, because that is the RNA technique. It's an entirely different technique of making a vaccine, as in case of Pfizer. But there is a new vaccine which is coming up in Europe, which is being tested, which is also using this very technique. Then we've got a tie-up between Baylor College and a Hyderabad company, and that is supposed to produce a very low-cost vaccine. But the problem is that we are way behind. I think where the government went wrong was they thought they got confident that they were ahead of the curve in March. Because we have survived the first wave, the second wave will always remain behind us. And in the meanwhile, a supply chain will catch up. But now that the tsunami has overtaken us, we are in the middle of it. So we have to recover very fast, because a stabilized India, an economically rising India, is essential to bring stability, because there is a huge power transition taking place. And the epidemic is exacerbating it, because it's allowing China to come out of its come out ahead, to remain growing at a higher speed. It has dealt a blow to India a second time. We have just begun recovering, and US needs to now, from here, decide how the technology war will be fought. They've started by closing down on chips. And they still continue to be supplying 70 to 80% of the high-end chips of the world. So the Chinese are scampering to make up for it, but they can't do it in the next 5 years. So there are gaps here available for us. We find 10 or 15 new companies have risen up India on the e-business field, worth over $1 billion. And this has happened in the last 1 year. And this is all over e-market. But the number of those companies in India which are rising is 1/4 the number in China. So we'll find this movement towards distance office work. In US, much of the commercial space is lying vacant. It may continue to lie vacant because bankers and office workers may not come back to those jobs the same way. The world may be quite different economically by the time this COVID tapers off. In any case, there would always be fear of another pandemic. So the world have to multilaterally create an agency, have much greater cooperation to see that this never happens again. And in the meanwhile, how do we adjust to this one? What do we do to a country like India, which has a large labor force? You can't simply move to the e-market. All of them can't move to e-market. So you have to remain in the manufacturing field. And at the same time, we are cut out from some of these blocks which are being created around you. Prime Minister spoke to EU yesterday. We've been talking of free trade association with them. Britain, in any case, being out of it, wants a separate one. So there'll be some of these things have been put on the back burner because of the epidemic. But once it eases, it levels off, it's not going to go away. There's a fear of a third wave. So we have to prepare for a third wave. In the meanwhile, quickly revive our economy, quickly see that we are back again into the global network and see how we can take advantage from much of the new idea, many new ideas, many new ways of doing business, which are going to come about, while at the same time retaining basic employment opportunities for a population. So I think I'll leave it there.
Mr. Singh, I think that was the most scholarly and the grandest vision you have given of what is happening and what is likely to happen. Actually, I'm at loss of words. The last 35 minutes has been really an education for all of us. There were many questions I would have asked you, but you have answered nearly all my questions. And of course, on the doubts persist on what exactly is happening in the world. The first question I would like to ask is what you had said earlier, that you did say that China won't stop pushing. What do you mean by that? Do you think that they'll continue to do this, what they call 1,000 cuts, or they'll push us economically? What exactly does it mean?
You see, they want to become a dominant power. At best, they want a G2, which is them and US. Russia has converged with them. Now, there will be differences of opinion between Russia and them on Central Asia, but the Russians as a declining power, as a stable military power, but as a declining and demographically declining and economically declining power, has tied up with them. Therefore, Russian interests are in Europe. They just want their status quo or push into Ukraine, and therefore NATO not coming closer. While they use technologies, cyber warfare, affecting democracies, undermining democracies. One argument is both China and US, China and Russia, are using their vaccines to actually undermine democracies or undermine governments. The Chinese go to a Latin American country, Central American country, and said, we'll give you vaccines if you break relations with Taiwan. The Russians will similarly go to countries where their Sputnik, now the second Sputnik is coming up, which is a single dose one. So if the Americans lag and the West lag, while they say, no, America first, we'll first have all the vaccines for ourselves, and then we are going to do it. 1.3 billion vaccines, mostly used in the developed world. Now, if that is going to happen, you're opening up space for China and Russia to use this technology. Now, China, President Xi has very, very clearly said what his ambition is. 2047, they want to be a dominant power. They call themselves a fully developed country, but you can see the military buildup. As they say, you don't have to go by intentions. You have to go by the military buildup. The military buildup, their missile buildup, their tweaking of their nuclear arsenal. All this is worrisome for the rest of the world, and their behavior in Ladakh that very clearly showed they were exploiting a weakness created by their own fault. In fact, there should be a move in the world to sue them. After all, if you go and have UN sanctions against Saddam Hussein for occupying Kuwait and causing damage there and recover money from him. I don't see why Chinese should not pay compensation for letting this pandemic escape. Nobody's talking about it. The only one who probably could have and did when he called it a China virus was Trump. But at some stage, I think this argument needs to come up. The Chinese, instead of exploiting it militarily and economically, should be on the back foot and paying damages to countries whose economies have lost. So therefore, I don't see Xi backing off. He's taken away the time limit on their terms. Traditionally, Chinese presidents have held 2 terms. And this was an orderly arrangement created by Deng Xiaoping after Mao. And that orderly arrangement worked till now. But Xi has centralized so much power. And the only way he can retain that power is by selling an economic dream and his social compact to his people, which is don't ask for political power, don't ask for human rights. We will give you economic wealth. So he needs to keep up on 2 elements. One is hyper-nationalism, and second is economic growth. So if you can slow their economic growth, they'll start. They may get a little more hyper-nationalistic, but at some stage, it may be difficult to sustain. They did stumble in 89 when they had Tiananmen Square, and the whole world was coming after them, but they managed to pick themselves up and rise, because by then Soviet Union fell, and Soviet Union broke up in 91, and the Americans were very happy they had defeated the Soviets, and the Chinese got again an out. So this will be difficult. I think the mistake they made is that one by one they can take on US, India, China, Japan, and Australia, but you can't take on these countries collectively. So their attempt will be to divide them, cut a deal with some of them. Look at the way the Chinese ambassador in Delhi gave out a long list of things flown, number of flights from China to bring medical equipment. But much of that is what is being bought by private people. They're not running a charity, and nor does India want charity from them. So I don't see China under Xi letting off. He'll have to be his pressure. No, you don't want war. What you want is basically, it'll have to be a combination of competition, confrontation, and in some areas cooperation, like in climate change. They will cooperate with the Americans, but their attempt will be, if we cooperate in this, will the Americans give us an out for a rise in Asia? Will the Americans give us a let there? Now, that is where I think the US leadership comes in, where Trump damaged US, is when he said, America first, I am leaving. He created a power vacuum. He created a psychological situation where Xi felt he could push without any retribution. Now, that psychological war, Biden is trying to recover that, but he knows his country is not yet ready to fully say that if you do anything to Taiwan, we will abide by an agreement and fight a war with you. They're not saying that yet. He also feels regional countries have to come together. But they're coming closer to saying that to Japan. Japanese are themselves rearming and getting over the restrictions put on them after Second World War. So they call it a peacekeeping force rather than a self-defense force rather than a military. Many of the helicopter carriers have flat decks, which can be turned overnight into aircraft carriers with the F-35s. So the Chinese also know that it's difficult to take on all the countries. So the squeeze has to be economic. They can't have a free run into every market they want. And they are seeing that their road to technology is getting shut. All countries are looking a second time at their acquisition of companies with cutting edge technologies. So they're not able to suck that technology out and therefore catch up in the technology war.
You have packed so much into your 1 hour talk that someone from the audience has commented that this is equal to 2 semesters of learning that we have to do from out of this.
I'm humbled. I'm humbled.
Thank you so very much.
Yes.
There are 100 questions that have come up. And one of the things that seems to bother everyone is why is it that we have failed to handle the pandemic, and what could have been done or what should be done now?
I think what has to be done is, and Lancet have said it very well. Yesterday, Dr. Fauci was on IBM. He said it very well. You need unity first. Prime Minister has to just understand there is no scope for polarization and partisan behavior. You have to reach out to the opposition. You have to sit down with the opposition. You can't be calling bureaucrats to talk to you. He needs a tweak of his team. He needs to be humble and accept that they made an error. That to continue with the elections, have an 8-phase election. I mean, the election commissioners, I think the Tamil Nadu High Court Chief Justice are not wrong what he said, that this is murder on their hands. How can you have an 8-phase election in the middle of a pandemic? This was complete, utter, dead politics in the face of medical science and common sense. Now, unless you're going to, and then you had people going on the television saying, you will not get infected if you are near Ganga Mata. This will not happen. Yesterday, I was doing a Punjabi program, and I said, I'm shocked to see at the Golden Temple, her 8th Guru, Guru Harkrishan, died as a young boy in Delhi, tending to smallpox victims. That's where Gurdwara Bangla Sahib is made. I said, we have a tradition of tending to people in a pandemic, and people are going to Golden Temple without covering their faces. What are we teaching as a more modern, more progressive religion? Where is the scope for religious? Where is the scope for this kind of this thing? So if you're going to have political interests, religious interests, domestic politics overtake science, medicine, common sense, you will suffer. And that's what happened. Trump went around, he felt sick himself, made people sick. A lot of people, why are the states which did worst have Republican governors? Why did the Democratic governors do better? Simply because they were denying science. They were not willing to accept it. So it's not just here. Bolsonaro, he is another one. Look at the three leaders. We don't know about our prime minister. Fortunately, he's not fallen sick. But 3 leaders, 3 right-wing leaders. Merkel didn't fall sick. Johnson did. Bolsonaro did. Trump did. Why did 3 leaders of 3 major countries get the virus themselves? So what is it? And then Trump comes out and says, look, I've survived. Nothing's happened to me. Now, if you're going to have this kind of behavior, if you're going to carry on with your partisan politics and not know who the real enemy is, then you are not going to be able to address it. And the people of India will punish you, but they'll take longer. There'll be a loss of life, but it'll be a difficult track. Why does US head the list of the number of cases and the number of dead? More than 500,000 dead. But Trump is gone. We are at number 2. And I think that's a warning signal to our government.
Before Ram may ask a question, I just want to say that what you have said should reach every thinking Indian. I mean, it's so important what you have said. Thank you. Ram.
You're muted, Ram.
Ram, you are muted.
The question here that, look, in this situation, 1 year after the pandemic, that China has few friends in the world. That, at the most, it is Russia kind of, some kind of relationship. But in this situation, what flexibility does China have in its international relations? And second, more specific thing, the question about India and Myanmar, that India participated in the Myanmar military parade after the crackdown. So what options does India have in Myanmar vis-a-vis democracy, and where does Myanmar stand vis-a-vis China? The 2 separate questions, but I'm just trying to link them.
I'll link the second one to G7 because that's interesting, because they also brought up democracy, role of, your commitment to democracy in India and abroad. And the first one is China. Look, Chinese are quite confident the way they are. They managed to create divisions in the ASEAN. Laos and Cambodia, they have on their sides. They don't want to let ASEAN function. Vietnam is the only one who's kind of standing up to them. Thailand military, they managed to compromise through weapons and all. So their ability to compromise leaders, and we've seen the change of leadership in Sri Lanka. Their defense minister was there. They're selling them goodies. And the Rajapaksa family is very, very close to them. They're trying to say they're playing a balancing game with India, but very clearly with the Chinese underwriting the balance of payments debt and giving money, and again getting Adani getting his contract withdrawn, and these guys continuing with their Colombo Port City project. So the Chinese will keep controlling. It's like a huge push, and they'll keep pushing forward. We've just had the speaker and a great ally of India in Maldives injured in a blast. Of course, the Chinese have nothing to do with it, but it hurts pro-India forces. In Nepal, the Chinese have pushed in. The battle for leadership is still on, but the current prime minister has a distinct tilt towards the Chinese. And therefore, the push of Chinese has literally come up to the Indian border. Nepal as a buffer is no longer available. And in Bhutan, they've actually created a village inside the Bhutanese territory, claiming this is our territory. And this is to put pressure on Bhutan So that gives a concession in some other part of Bhutan, which gives them an advantage over India. And in Myanmar, they have a difficult situation because I don't think they don't understand democracies. And I think India is also making a mistake there by seeing as aligned with the military. Because the military, I think, has bitten off more than they can chew this time. The people have really risen up. The regional forces which opposed ethnic groups have all combined. So they are finding it very difficult to contain what's happening there in Myanmar. So at this stage, the military will carry on. India has taken a pragmatic stand that we need them, but I don't buy it. I am not in favor of a totally non-ideological, non-moral approach to foreign policy. It can't be all moral, but it can't be immoral either. So it's Brzezinski wrote his book called Power and Principle. So all great powers have this dilemma. When do you use power and when do you use principle? I gave you the example of Obama. He tried bringing in principle, it didn't work. By the same time, it can't be universal principle that no, we'll only be pragmatic. It doesn't care what happens, they can do what they want. And that's where G7 comes in. A foreign minister had been invited there, not as a participant on the sidelines. And the foreign ministers and the development ministers were meeting. Of course, he had to be isolated because of, again, COVID, which reflected again internationally, made it news that the delegation of even the ministers are COVID positive. So you can see the situation in India. But they made a very important point. They said, we are at a very important juncture for the world, where our values, where liberal democracy, where our very future is challenged. I think the developed world realizes you cannot counter China simply by economic or military power. There has to be also soft power and moral power and the power of governance, the power of open societies. And that's where India is caught in the middle. You can't be doing what you do. You take on Rehana and Grunberg, the climate activist, simply because they support the Indian farmers protesting in India. And you start calling them names and say you've taken money from people. Now, this kind of thin skin puts you in neither the Chinese camp nor in the Western camp. You have to have the ability to absorb it, the ability to self-correct, the ability to realize that these are not Western values. Human rights were taught by Lord Buddha. These are not values that we learned after the Human Rights Declaration of 1948. Therefore, those values are universal. Those values are part of our culture. And we should not be scoffing at countries which show us a mirror. So this thing will go on. I think G7 have very clearly told you that, look, we want to be partners. We know we need India, but we need a certain kind of India. India is less of a use to us. If India is going to be a very reluctant partner and say, I will run my things as I want, I will deal with my domestic politics as I want, but at the same time, please help me when it comes to climate change, help me when it comes to epidemic, help me with this, open up your markets. So all this is going to be a package. And therefore, I think pandemic may end up with some of these divisions becoming more frozen, where Europe and these countries may more strongly defend these values now, realizing that to stop China and Russia, you have to draw these red lines. Now, coming to the neighborhood, I very quickly had mentioned how the Chinese have intruded. This balancing will go on. We'll gain some, we'll lose some. The Chinese have deeper pockets. But at the same time, if you're going to bring in every now and then your domestic politics into your other politics, every time you have an election, if you're going to bring Pakistan into it to fight your national election, or you're going to bring in Bangladesh into it to fight your Assam election, or you're going to bring Sri Lanka into it to fight election somewhere else, then you are not going to have stable relations. You have to insulate your domestic politics to the extent possible from your relationships with the neighboring countries, tempting as it may be to use them opportunistically just to gain some advantage.
There is
No, but the one question I have is, where does India's insecurity come from as far as the diplomatic international relations are concerned? Why do we overreact to statements by Rihanna or Greta Thunberg or whoever they are? I mean, I'm sure India's position in the world of international relations is so stronger than individuals making statements against that. Is it that the current diplomatic force is insecure, unsure of themselves, lack of direction? What do you think is happening?
You see, what's happened is the Prime Minister has created a persona of an international statesman. He has broken the barriers between domestic and international politics. Now, there's always been in various democratic countries, you have a tradition that you do not carry your differences abroad. Opposition, Atalji went abroad in the opposition, he would not criticize the Congress. When he was in power, he will not criticize the opposition when he was abroad. He did not gather. He was capable. He was a great orator. He could gather the diaspora and whip them up. But Prime Minister has begun it from the beginning, using the diaspora to bait the opposition in India and have them raise slogans against them while on foreign soil. Now, once you create, and then also invite local politicians to show them your clout with the diaspora. Now, this is a new game. India has always used the diaspora. Even Manmohan Singh time they used it. Narasimha Rao's time we used it. But it was used subtly. Your outreach to the diaspora to reach the local Republican or Democratic senators, or in England to neutralize the Pakistani influence, we always did it. But now it's been done more blatantly. A really blatant example of that was the Houston rally, where it's completely not done. In the year of the election, you do not go dancing with an incumbent president facing an election, literally raising a slogan indirectly in his support. It was not directly saying, but simply saying ab ki bar and having the crowd respond. Prime Minister had the dog whistle. No, you don't do it. And then you end up embarrassed when Biden comes in. Because this is why these traditions are there, that you do not align publicly with groupings there unless you are a major power. You're creating governments. In your neighborhood, we have done it. We put King Mahendra back on the throne of Nepal. It wasn't done by a BJP government. It was done by Nehru. We annexed Sikkim. It was done by Indira Gandhi. We annexed Goa when we were still not a major power. So there are times that India has acted unilaterally. But then you act when you are able to control the outcomes in those countries. You do not go into big countries and start taking sides in an election. So this insecurity has come because your person, the image you have created internationally of a statesman is getting damaged by this. You have an image within the country, you have an image outside the country. Now, once that image starts getting damaged, and you've been using that image domestically, you and your supporters, see Modi ji has been on the cover of this, see Modi ji has been this. Now, if you use it when the good news comes, then you can't avoid it when the bad news comes. Then you become irritated because you don't want that. So it's part of a factor of the leader's personality and the ruling party's ethos. It's got nothing to do with diplomacy.
If I may take a small digression, you passingly mentioned about Kashmir, and you also said that Kashmir problem cannot be solved with using only one strategy. Would you want to amplify on that?
No, that's a given. We've seen in Punjab. You see, in Punjab, we say KPS Gill managed to handle Punjab. He didn't. Once he and Falero they both failed. He and Robero both failed. It's when Beyant Singh was elected as chief minister, Beyant Singh in combination with KPS Gill, because Beyant Singh over Saturday, Sunday would travel extensively in Punjab and meet the people and get the feedback. Because if you give too much power to the security force also tends to become like the very force it is fighting. It becomes repressive. It becomes, starts twisting arms, and therefore it starts crossing lines, which instead of, and that is what Petraeus did. The counterterrorism strategy that worked for America in 2006, 2007 in Baghdad was earlier they would be in their green zone. When there was an attack, they'd go with choppers and jeeps and shoot up people. They started patrolling. They started reaching out to people at the local level. They opened up to people. And once that happens, the communication, you cannot fight any militancy without, of course, here the additional problem is it is fed from a neighboring country. That even when you reach out here, but you do not provide a fertile ground. I remember I was coordinator counterterrorism for 2 years at headquarters, 2005 to 2007 till I became secretary. And we had 27 working groups with different countries, and I would lead the delegation. Common question in US, in Europeans, they would ask us is, Canada, how is it you have the second largest Muslim population in the world, but the number of people who have gone and joined the international jihad are not even in barely low double digits, never touched 3 digits. That's because the minority felt secure in India. The minority felt that that may have been turned around later as appeasement. But essentially, the fact that even Pakistan was not able to create major disaffection amongst the Muslim community in India is a sign that we were a functioning, multi-religious, multi-ethnic democracy where people felt that they had a stake in the current state of affairs and there was scope available for redressing their grievances within the system.
That's great. Saddam, I think you're muted.
Slightly different question here in the light of recent events. That there are a lot of people now on the upper middle classes that are talking about things are so bad, we must migrate. So there is a renewed urge for a brain drain. So what is your view on that? Is this something that we can turn around?
I think it's a matter of messaging. I would discourage it. I have lived abroad. I've served abroad. There is no place like your own country. And this country is where more billions are going to be made. In other countries, the billions have been made already. But this is a country with its population, its base. It has to just get its act together and make no mistakes. There is a yearning. When you ask the average Indian, they want a strong leader. But strong leaders cause more damage. We've seen Indira Gandhi led to an emergency. We've seen how the epidemic has been handled. We saw how demonetization has been handled. When you take the growth rate of India, it continues about the same even when there's a coalition government. So as they say, India runs despite a government, not because of a government. A strong government, really, it's a continent. And this example I must give, Henry Kissinger in his book on China, he compares India and China. He says China has been a unitary government continuously from about 4th century BC. One power center has run it. It may have shrunk in size. It may not have had Tibet, may not have had Xinjiang, may not have had Mongolia. But between the two rivers, they may have had civil war. But there was a unitary power. India has been a unitary power only thrice in 2,500 years. You had the Mauryas, you had the Mughals, and you had the British. So which would be a total of what? About 700 years. Out of 2,500, 1,800 years, the natural genius of India is towards a coalition, towards a happy family, towards a rejection of over prescription. You need a union government that knows how to utilize the diverse energies of India, not try turning India into one kind of state, communist or extreme right wing. That is the lesson coming from West Bengal election. You cannot, West Bengal is resisted that message of turning them into another UP. They didn't want that. So therefore, this is a message. This is a message Tamil Nadu gave out. This is a message Kerala gave out. Now, if this message is not read, but I will tell the people, this is a civilization. It is not a country. You can't leave it. You have to stay here and serve it.
Yeah. Another question, if I may, Ajay.
Yeah, please.
Sometimes, the common citizen is not able to understand the intricacies of international relations. Now, recently we had India participating in the Quad meeting, but within a couple of days, US warships went through India's economic zone without informing India. Now, what are these games that are being played, and what are the messages being sent?
Look, I will not place too much emphasis on it for the simple reason that US has not signed the UN Convention on Law of the Seas. So they say that with the UN Convention laws of the seas, 200 nautical miles or 300 nautical miles, if you take off every country which is claiming, very few high seas are left. And they are a maritime power. They've always been a global maritime power, and they don't like their maritime power restricted. Yes, it would have been, but if they start asking India, then how do they go through what China claims in the South China Sea or anybody else claims? So it becomes a public embarrassment for India. But I would not place too much. I will not get too irritated by it, and probably convey to them that in future, hey guys, just give us a shout. We are not stopping you, but don't cause an embarrassment for us. But very often these things are not that the instructions have come from the president. These are part of their normal operational procedures. and they keep conducting them. And we have to work with them as close to them, a partnership short of an alliance. Then this kind of functioning will take place. And I would not. The only thing is that we can't not object, because tomorrow the Chinese can do it. They'll say you didn't object when the Americans did it, and you don't want the Chinese come close to your territorial waters, because then they can snoop, or the Pakistanis. Because remember, the biggest terrorist attack against India came from the maritime domain, the one on Mumbai. People came in boats. So therefore, protecting a maritime domain is extremely important. And we can't allow what we are allowed under the UN Convention to go uncontested. But we can tell the Americans not to do it. And I'm sure they might be mindful. Let's see. Let's hope so.
Oh, there's a question here on this vaccine diplomacy which India has attempted. Don't you think that is well-timed? And even though that we were short of resources, we were building international relations from a position of strength, because we have the vaccine capacity. Whatever little we have, we are willing to share it internationally. But where did we go wrong there too?
I think what I said earlier, we went wrong because at that stage, even though the cases had begun appearing in India, BJP leaders meeting to congratulate the Prime Minister in overcoming COVID, allowing Kumbh, allowing the elections, I think they did not see what was over the horizon. They thought they will remain ahead of the second wave. In the meanwhile, they thought Covaxin will catch up production. Promises were made, some money had been paid, although Serum Institute had been asking for money for many months, which was delayed again by 1 or 2 months. It should have been given much earlier. So I think the supply side there was a smugness about the supply side, and there was a lack of understanding of how fast the second wave was approaching. That was a strategic and medical negligence. Therefore, at that stage, now looking back, at that stage, they thought we have enough. Now, therefore, they thought, let's compete with the Chinese, let's compete with the others and send them. In any case, certain amount of them, even Serum Institute had committed to the globally shared COVAX program. So don't forget, Bill Gates had given $200 million to Serum Institute for those shots which he is not able to supply fully. So all those were not, government has not mentioned this, but they should really break it up. All that we sent abroad and were exported were not what India sent. Some of them would have gone into the COVAX thing, which is what Serum Institute was committed to give because of the Bill Gates advance. But very clearly, it's a misunderstanding of the speed of the second wave and the speed of a vaccine production. And they've got it both wrong. It's simple as that. And now they got, mud on their face.
I think that's what...
Ram, would you like to ask anything before I ask the last question? You are muted, Ram.
Yeah, Ajay, yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
So one point you made was that worldwide right-wing governments have failed to handle the pandemic as effectively as liberal dispensations have been able to do. I believe that that's a correct assessment. How does one as a citizen want to change it or can change it?
Well, don't vote in another right-wing government in 2024. That's the obvious lesson. Unless the right-wing government learns the lesson from this. It doesn't seem to have learned any lesson from the past mistakes. And I think the people have learned the lesson. I don't know about the government. And the people will speak. This is how it functions in a democracy. You see, the Germans have done better. The French didn't do too well, and the Italians, of course, did badly because they were hit first. But they've corrected very fast. But certainly they didn't make the kind of mistakes that Trump was doing, which brought the most powerful country in the world to its knees. Now, that takes some doing. Yeah. Country with capabilities, medical, technological capabilities, should have been helping others, should have been up ahead of the curve. So instead, it left the country on its knees, which fortunately Biden, by his quick vaccination, is now trying to restore. But in the meantime, and that is why you didn't ask that question, but let me answer because there was a question here. Why are the Americans ignoring us when we are in difficulty? Because for about 2 weeks, there was no sound out of America. Yeah. They didn't talk about vaccinations being sent. We are sitting on a huge amount of AstraZeneca, which they haven't even approved for US. And they're sitting on that stock, but they were not even willing to share that. I think what happened is, firstly, because Biden's own agenda was, I am going to first vaccinate America, so many million by such a date. And he's done it by that date. And he realized that till he does that and starts bringing normalcy to life, socioeconomic life in America, US cannot stand on its feet and it can't help others. Then they realized that India realized belatedly that India was really in dire straits, partly for India's own, because of India's own mistake. If we kept saying we are on top of it, the other people thought you are on top of it, you'll handle it. But when the pictures started appearing on the front pages of New York Times of bodies burning, of columns being written, their correspondents reporting, chief ministers registering cases against people who were complaining, then they suddenly woke up. They said, hey, guys, there's something wrong here. I think that's where Biden then overrode the resistance within the system. Incidentally, I don't think we are still out in the clear on the TRIPS thing, because the language you see used at G7 is the language of we will encourage our companies to talk to different countries. They're not saying we'll allow a waiver. So there'll be more pushing which needs to be done by President Biden if he's indeed sincere that some of these intellectual property rights have to be waived, like with the HIV drugs. And therefore, some of these vaccines have to be in India also. It can't be just these two companies. The government should be reopening many public sector units, starting many others, sharing the technology with them, at least lift it on Covaxin. And in case of Moderna, incidentally, it's almost totally financed by the US government. It's not that Moderna put in all the money. So they can easily apply the pressure there. And we can apply the pressure to Covaxin. We can't apply it to Covaxild. So they should apply the pressure and say, hey, this formula will be shared. But we don't know. If on vaccination distribution, you're going towards market forces, then you're not really functioning to control the supply side the way you should be controlling.
I think this government believes that right to misinformation is a fundamental right.
Yes.
The last question I'll ask is from a friend who has sent it to us. To what extent do you think the Z policy will outlive Z in China?
Sorry, what policy?
The present policy, will it outlast the person pushing it?
You mean the current government's handling of epidemic?
Yeah.
Look, Prime Minister has a history of not accepting any mistakes he makes. Well, that's part of his personality. He's not the first one. Other leaders have also been like that. Trump would never say he made a mistake, whether he did or not till the end. Till now, he doesn't say he made any mistake. So most leaders in the world do not accept their mistakes. There are some who do, there are most who don't. But we are not interested in that. We are interested in whether he's able to self-correct and self-correct very quickly. Why do you need the Supreme Court to give a detailed, reasoned order on how a policy on distribution of oxygen should be created? Certainly, I've been in the government at the secretary level. There are any number of secretaries under the cabinet secretary who can sit down and produce that note. What is so high-tech about that note that it could not be produced? Or you could call up people from amongst the top 5 hospitals, make them sit with you and produce a note on it and put it up to the Prime Minister. Why it is not happening is what troubles me. That either the bureaucracy has got ossified, there is fear to put up your views, or nobody is seeking your views. Your views are not being encouraged. You feel that if you give any views, you'll be seen as a dissenter, and therefore make it punished rather than rewarded. Now, that is something only a Prime Minister can change. That is not something which can change because a court wants it or somebody else wants it. But the good thing is that after the change of the Chief Justice, with the new CJI coming in, we are seeing a new movement on the part of Supreme Court to take a position where executive actions are being judged, are being assessed, are being commented upon, are being not given the free pass they were getting earlier.